These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? Ever since London's National Gallery opened its doors nearly 2 centuries ago, people have flocked through them for a glimpse of its exceptional collection. In the early days, there were only 38 pictures to look at here, as against well over 2,000 now. Every single important Western art movement is represented here, running from the early Middle Ages right the way through to the early 20th century. Here you will find extraordinary achievements which have changed the course of art history in room after room after room. Behind every piece here, there is a story. But there is one painting, and you will know it, whose impact on the story of Western art is perhaps particularly surprising. I'm talking about John Constable's The Hay Wain. This is, in essence, a very, very simple image of the little pinch of England that Constable knew best. It's the Suffolk-Essex border, the River Stour, and in the middle there is a hay wain, a cart which has just delivered its load of hay over here to Flatford Mill, the Constable family business. That's Willie Lott's cottage on the left, a building Constable knew very well and drew and sketched obsessively all his life. In the far distance, you can not only see the harvesters scything and working away, little blobs in the distance working very hard. You can, if you look really carefully, see a second hay wain, in this case absolutely laden with hay, and the little boy sitting on top of it. It's almost completely disguised by the trees, but it's there. For such a gentle scene, it's extraordinary how it's imprinted itself on the national psyche. Everything is lapping and moving in a kind of gorgeous, midsummer, golden haze. I think the overarching feeling of this painting is calm and peace. There is a natural order, and all is well with this world. This is most people's ideal of what the serene English countryside should look like. But behind the canvas, there is an unexpected story. It is a story of rebellion, above all, a story of painting and working against the odds, of believing in yourself when nobody else will, and believing also that even in the most remote corners of the countryside, you can do new things so radical and extraordinary, they will spark revolutions a very long way from home. If you want to understand the world of this masterpiece and the man who created it, you have to begin in his beloved Suffolk, the landscape that fed his imagination for his entire life. John Constable was born in this village on the 11th of June, 1776.
He is one of 6 children who are the product of a very happy and steady marriage between his parents Anne and Golding Constable.
Golding Constable is often described as a miller, but that's actually doesn't quite give the right impression of his status. He was more of a rural entrepreneur.
Wanting for nothing, Constable described his comfortable early life as a careless childhood. For Simon Peachy from the National Trust, there are clues across East Berkholt which reveal the kind of upbringing the young Constable enjoyed.
Constable family home was just on the other side of these railings, but the railings are the only part of the house that exists today. In his time, it was a big mansion, one of the biggest houses in East Berkholt. He painted some famous pictures of the kitchen garden and the flower garden. And you can imagine it's standing here, what the house and the grounds would have looked like.
Constable had a very privileged life. His father was rich. He came from this wonderfully comfortable background, and he loved the countryside. He was always out sketching the countryside.
He was absolutely adamant that he wanted to be a painter, although nobody in his family, or even remotely connected with his family, had ever been an artist.
Constable was inspired by Suffolk's vast, overarching skies, thickly wooded glades and busy rivers, but he didn't know how to channel his passion until a chance encounter.
When he was 19, he met a travelling connoisseur, George Beaumont, who was an amateur painter and always travelled with one of his paintings by the 17th century French painter Claude, and he showed it to Constable, and that was the first masterpiece he would have seen.
This was the first time he saw a painting that began to match how he felt about landscape, that gave him the same kind of thrill he felt sketching. The path to the Hay Wain, however, would not be easy. The first blot on the landscape was in the shape of his formidable father.
Golding, having made a substantial fortune and set up a very sound business, wanted John to take over the business. And there was a big tussle with his father about that.
With great unhappiness, he knuckled under. The only advantage was that running mills meant he became a skilled observer of the weather, a professional eye essential for his art. His determination to be a painter didn't wane, and after 5 long years, he finally got his way.
It wasn't until quite late on, 1799, when he was well into his 20s, that he got permission to go to London and start training as an artist.
Now 23, he headed for the chaotic hubbub of the capital to study at the Royal Academy. He was given a basic income of £100 to pay for board and lodgings by his reluctant father. That's only £8,000 in today's money. This meagre allowance meant that Constable was doubly desperate for success as an artist. And to achieve that, he first needed to get his landscapes into the great summer exhibition.
If you want to be an artist, you have to make it at the Academy. This is a very real competition for money, for patronage, and above all, for reputation. And if you are exhibited in the Academy in what's known as the Great Room, where you will be seen by the great and the good, you know you've made it.
But the great and the good barely got a chance to see Constable's paintings, because even the few that were accepted were seen as drearily unfashionable.
Constable has set himself a very difficult furrow to plough. At the time, history painting is considered to be the most prestigious. Instead, he's chosen to specialise in landscape, which is seen to be a much more inferior genre. And within landscape itself, he is also not choosing to do grand historical landscapes. Instead, he's chosen a type of scenery which actually would be considered by most people to be very bland, very workaday, boring, unexceptional sorts of places.
Considering he was quite a mild-mannered man, one would think that he might have thought, well, I'll have a go at what everybody else likes. But no, he insisted he wanted to paint in this way. He was fascinated by painting nature as he saw it.
But it wasn't just the subjects that failed to arrest visitors' attention. His relatively small canvases were lost against the vast classical landscapes by other exhibitors, like the hugely successful J.M.W. Turner.
I think effectively nobody much noticed them. They were hung not just side by side on the wall, up 3, 4, 5 high, and in order to pick up attention, somehow it had to have some sort of real star quality, and Constable couldn't manage to muster that.
Constable was surrounded by the painting superstars of the age, doing those huge historical canvases and glossy, fashionable portraits, exactly what the Royal Academy and its patrons really wanted. And at the same time, Constable was painting exactly what he really wanted, which was stunningly, amazingly unpopular. Unsuccessful, unappreciated and poor, the future wasn't looking bright for John Constable. But perseverance is all. He wasn't so far away from a masterpiece that would propel him to international fame. He realised that to get noticed, bigger would be better. Next up would be his famous 6-footers. It's hard to think of a painting more English than the Hay Wain, a scene indelibly linked to the national psyche. And yet, for most of his life, its creator, John Constable, was far from a success. For an artist now seen as so very conservative, he was remarkably experimental, which didn't help sales. Now, it's not that he didn't want to earn money. Early on, he took church commissions, and all his life he painted portraits to keep the cash rolling in. But what really turned Constable on was the magic of the English countryside in all its seasons. The softness, the fertile freshness, and above all, those subtle, glowing colours. He was happiest when painting his placid scenes, but doing so in a radically new way. He valued what he saw in the raw, with his own eyes, nature unfiltered. He could only do this by working outdoors, which was both unconventional and irritatingly difficult.
He believed you couldn't paint nature unless you looked at it. So he wasn't painting every leaf, but he was painting what to us looks extremely realistic, extremely naturalistic. And this was so radical for the time.
At that point, most people painted in studios. And Constable was seen sometimes as a little bit mad for wanting to paint outdoors. It was a difficult process. Now you can buy little portable paint pots and little tubes of paint. Then he had to take his paints, most of which he would have made himself, in a kind of pig's bladder or some kind of animal skin pouch that would not let the paint go dry. It was a really big performance, and that's why most people didn't do it. Constable was seen as very unusual.
Despite the innovation and the obsessive effort, all of which would eventually feed into his Hay Wain, these paintings failed to find buyers. So when the struggling artist fell in love and married Maria, a childhood friend from a well-to-do family, the daughter of King George IV's solicitor, life suddenly became a lot more complicated.
The romance of John Constable and Maria Bicknell is a Jane Austen story with lots of complications, opposition from the family, dramas, unexpected meetings, all that sort of thing.
Neither family thought they should marry. Her family didn't like him because they thought he'd never be rich enough as an artist to support her.
Constable still had a small share of the family business, but this didn't bring in much. So, to try to provide for his new wife and young family, he now needed to make his painting finally pay its way.
It was not an easy journey for Constable. He struggled financially and emotionally all through his artistic career.
And yet there was this drive in him to produce these naturalistic paintings, to carry on painting the skies in such detail and to paint the water. Even though he felt that he was a failure, he carried on, hoping that other people would see what he could see.
The single-minded Constable would not compromise on the unpopular style or narrow subject of his paintings.
He was extremely strong-minded, absolutely determined about what he wanted to do. And actually, one of the things about Constable is that he gets most of his major pictures for years and years from a few hundred yards of the river, which he knew intimately well.
Then, in 1819, he widened his gaze and inspiration struck. Since his smaller canvases were lost on walls full of epic paintings, why not think a lot bigger?
One of the things he does is to come up with a completely new kind of exhibition landscape, which he calls the 6-footer, where he explodes his River Stour scenes that he's so keen to reveal the everyday poetry and beauty of, up to a monumental scale that would be more readily associated with epic history painting.
The first of these 6-footers is called The White Horse, which he unveiled to the Royal Academy later that year.
Crucially, it sold. And finally, he felt that he was starting to get somewhere. These large-scale paintings really started to give him hope that he was going to make it as a landscape artist.
For the first time, people really begin to sit up and take notice of him. I think the pictures are simply too big not to be noticed.
Unsurprisingly, Constable planned to go big again with his next canvas, one he'd been thinking about and prepping for years, and the painting that would finally establish his place in history. The Hay Wain evokes a Suffolk scene that Constable grew up with, and we know he knew very well indeed. But it was painted here in London, more than 70 miles southwest of the original subject. So, obvious question, how did Constable get that juicy freshness from so very, very far away? Leafing through earlier images of Constable's work, it becomes increasingly obvious that the Hay Wain is not one single moment in time, but the culmination of years and years of looking and painting and drawing. So, for example, here from 11 years before the Hay Wain is another painting of Flatford Lock, lovely, fresh, lush and beautiful, and of the buildings around Flatford Lock, again 10 years beforehand. He's already noting down the details of the buildings. And the Hay Wain itself, well, there are lots of drawings of horses and carts and wains, I suppose you'd call them. Here's a rather crude one where he's clearly working very fast from life. You can see that by the nervousness of the pencil lines, if you like. Lots and lots of redrawing around the figure and so forth. That could only be from life, but very beautiful. And here, for instance, is a more completed drawing, again of a cart and two horses in this case, and he's fascinated by the way the shadows fall around the wheel, the rim of the wheel, the spokes, everything is in great detail. This is a man who is always watching, always noting, and crucially, always remembering. It would take him 2 years to complete after Constable started preparing the Hay Wain at his London studio in 1819. Maria, however, was struggling with her health, and so a change of scenery and cleaner air were essential in the summer months.
London, which was a city of 1 million people with medieval sanitation and primitive infrastructure, heated entirely by coal, was so polluted that you could see a sort of dome-shaped grey cloud hanging over it from 15, 20 miles away.
Constable moved his family north to just beside Hampstead Heath to avoid the smog. It may seem surprising to find the home of a man so associated with rural life here, but this part of London, the country in the town, would matter in his struggle to create the Hay Wain. The current owner of his last address in Hampstead is Christine Pullen.
Constable loved the house, but he complained to his friend John Fisher that living here was ruining him because he was paying 4 guineas a week for the house furnished at a time when an artisan family could be housed and fed on £1 a week. So that was an enormous sum, and he had a growing family, and he was not selling many pictures at that time.
But there was one definite advantage in paying those bills.
This is the backyard of the house, where Constable found a shed containing mops and brooms and buckets and coals, and he cleared the shed out in order to create a small workroom where he could work on his sketches. Here, he was in the middle of the countryside, effectively, then, and he liked the open views of the skies and made a lot of sketches while he was living at 2 Lower Terrace. He called it skying.
On the heath, he would spend days with his eyes glued to the skies and clouds, a delighted weatherman. Only 4 years before Constable began making his annual excursions to Hampstead, the first ever book of cloud classifications had been published. This was a text he's thought to have read, as he believed that we see nothing until we truly understand it, and the details of the skies he sketched here would eventually find their way into the Suffolk of the Hay Wain.
Constable was fascinated by the passing clouds and the changing of the light. It's very similar to the skies in East Anglia, and I think that's one of the aspects of Hampstead that attracted him to the area.
While Constable was lost in his obsession perfecting the skies for the Hay Wain, for perhaps the first time there was a good reason for him not to be in Suffolk. The Industrial Revolution was sweeping across Britain. Infrastructure and agriculture were changing fast. The rivers and the mills were now part of a capitalist economy, ripping up the old ways and plunging many rural workers into uncertainty and hunger.
The agricultural labourers were leaving their work to go and work in the cities, and then those who were staying to work were finding that agriculture started to become much more mechanised. It was a time of huge inequality, a lot of poverty, and a lot of people who were really eking out a subsistence either from the land or from a very poorly paid job.
Less than 4 years before Constable began his Hay Wain, a sharp hike in the cost of bread led to riots across East Anglia.
The poor labourers couldn't afford bread. They weren't earning enough to even pay for bread. The only thing they could do to try and draw attention to themselves and to their families that were starving was to riot and protest.
Torched by despairing workers, much of Constable's home patch was now surrounded by the glare of fires. And as he began work on the Hay Wain, how much of this rebellion would be reflected in it? Absolutely none. This is the art of a Tory idealist, not a social realist. And this, I think, is what's particularly striking about Constable's painting. It is political art. Not directly, he's certainly not shouting or stabbing a finger at us, but he is saying that this vision of natural harmony and social peace, not what you're reading in the newspapers about turmoil and strikes and protests, but this is how it ought to be. In terms of his technique, the way he put paint on the canvas, Constable was an avant-garde, progressive painter. But in terms of his message, what he was trying to say, he was profoundly conservative. By 1821, preparations for the final canvas were coming together. Now, what I find really exciting is the way that you can follow the progression of the work by sketches and images as it develops. So right at the beginning, you have a very, very loose, very impressionistic picture. This could have been done by Monet or any of the Impressionists in the 1870s, it seems to me. It's very, very loose, very fresh, and I love it. Lots of people love the sketches particularly. And then later on, there's a more worked-up version, which is very clearly the same painting, exactly the same design. The colours are slightly more muted and the paintwork is looser, but he's clearly got in focus exactly what he's going to paint. And then you get the final version. Suddenly the colours bounce out and it's fresh and complete, the final and perfect 6-footer. It was the hauling together of all of these images, the triumphant compilation of a body of work Constable had been at since childhood, which makes this 6-footer such an extraordinary moment. The Hay Wain isn't just a picture, it is the combination of 40 years of looking and working. It is everything that Constable knew on a single page. He was ready to give the world his masterpiece, but was the world ready to receive it? The Hay Wain, the most famous work by the 19th century artist John Constable, is widely regarded as the quintessential English landscape painting. Completed in 1821, the scene looks calm, serene, and effortless, though the process of creating it was anything but. Constable was one of the great painters of British weather. Now, lots and lots of people, of course, had painted skies and clouds and wood throughout art history, but in almost all cases, they weren't really painted or drawn by people who had sat outside in the real weather, the English weather, as Constable had for months and months and months and got flies all over him and got soaked by the rain. He'd studied the clouds obsessively for years, month in, month out, and these are real clouds. They're moving at speed. You can tell they're moving fast. The wind is up. And there's a real sense of wateriness about this picture, not just the river splashing away and moving quite fast, the little boy fishing in it there and some ducks rising from the river, but also the sense of the cycle of water. Constable once wrote about the sound of water escaping from mill dams, willows, old rotten planks, slimy posts and brickwork. I love such things. As long as I do paint, I shall never cease to paint such places. These have always been my delight. You can tell it's rained relatively recently, that the mud is still wet, but there is more rain to come. You can see there's a heavy cloud there. There's going to be another shower. Not a drenching downpour, but just enough to produce that delicate freshness, the juiciness in the English landscape that Constable always thought should be there. He submitted it to the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition of 1821. His last painting there, The White Horse, had been warmly received, and he hoped this would be even more so. As his fellow artists crowded into the Academy's rooms, he must have wondered if this would be the painting that proved he had been right all along.
When the Hay Wain was hung in the Royal Academy, people didn't like it. They didn't want it.
People were shocked. They were quite horrified that he would be so bold as to paint just a landscape that size. He was just sneered at.
This is a farm wagon he's painting. There aren't any mountains, there aren't any waterfalls, there aren't any wild rocks. It's just a pool in a rather ordinary little river in East Anglia.
One of the things they find problematic is what they call Constable's snow or piebald scumbling, the little dashes and brushstrokes of white pigment, which he liberally adds as the final layer of finish to a picture to capture what he describes as the elusive quality of sparkle in nature. But during the 19th century, people could not read those dabs of paint as anything other than dabs of paint. They couldn't see them for the visual metaphor they were meant to be, only as a very sort of troubling interruption on the surface of the picture. But I think his biggest problem is simply a lack of interest in what he's doing.
This was nearly a dreary disaster for Constable, except that there was one crucial visitor who could see its genius clearly.
One of the people to see the Hay Wain when it's exhibited at the Royal Academy in London is a French visitor to the capital, Théodore Géricault, who is being feted all over town for his incredible masterpiece, The Raft of the Medusa, an icon of French Romantic painting.
It's been said that Géricault's opinion of the Hay Wain changed the history of art forever.
He describes himself as quite stunned by it.
And rather than dismiss it as a strange work of art, as most of the British viewers had, he was amazed by it. He was spellbound. He saw something in it that the British hadn't seen.
So now an art dealer in Paris picked up on Géricault's excitement, and he suggested Constable send his painting to France to be exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1824. This was an unexpected thing to happen, but it was a real coup for John Constable.
The Parisian Salon at the Louvre is the art event of the Western world. If you were to use a sporting metaphor, then you could describe the Royal Academy as being like the Athletics World Championship, but the Salon is like the Olympics. It's the gold standard, and if you've made it there, you really have made it.
The Hay Wain was now going to be seen by the most important and influential French artists. But would a painting, the very epitome of Englishness, find favour with the French when it had failed so dismally at home?
When Constable's The Hay Wain was exhibited in the Paris Salon, that's when people's eyes opened and they wept in front of it because they realised what an astonishing painting it really was.
The French adored Constable instantly, a coup de foudre. Later, a curator at the Louvre would go on to call him the Messiah of landscape painting.
French artists cannot believe the originality and the freshness of Constable's approach. They're also drawn to the fact that Constable is painting his own native landscape. This is not a site drawn from classical antiquity. It is clearly somewhere very specific in England. One of the artists who sees it is Eugène Delacroix, who immediately goes to his own painting, The Massacre at Scios, a painting about a terrible slaughter of Greek inhabitants during the Greek War of Independence, and immediately starts to repaint areas of it based upon the handling that he sees in Constable's picture.
Constable's use of colour delighted Delacroix. He wrote, "What he says here about the green of his meadows can be applied to every tone." And the change of fortunes didn't end there for Constable and this revolutionary painting.
The work of this previously obscure British artist started to have a huge impact on French art as a whole.
From Delacroix, we go very quickly on to artists in his circle who begin to paint landscapes of the French countryside a la Constable, with sort of Hay Wain-esque tumble-down cottages beside a pond.
Constable's impact was seismic. His devotion to capturing a moment in nature through immersing himself in the outdoors inspired Paris. Here, in Constable's skies and sweet rural fields, was the groundwork for Impressionism. Meanwhile, radicals like Rousseau, Millet and Manet would soon be seeking out Constable's canvases for themselves. Constable's Hay Wain didn't just overturn the French art scene, it also transformed his own fortunes. Constable now sold more paintings in France than he'd managed during his entire career in Britain. That meant enough French francs rolling in to save Constable's bacon. But there is something quite extraordinary about this, is there not? There is John Constable, the ultimate patriotic, conservative image maker of rural England, and it's Paris that saves him. Thank God for the French. Great art is always rooted somewhere, but it is never limited by flags and national borders. But fame and fortune across the Channel was of little interest to Constable. He said, "I would rather be a poor man in England than a rich man abroad." And so when he was invited to France to be awarded a royal honour by the king himself, his response shouldn't have been a surprise.
He was given a gold medal, which would have been presented by Charles X, but Constable flatly refused to travel to Paris to receive it in person. In fact, never left Britain. The furthest he ever went was the Lake District, and that was on the sort of outside edge of what Constable regarded as possible.
Despite this profound distaste for travel, Constable's prospects were definitely improving. But just 4 years after being celebrated as England's most innovative painter at the Paris Salon, disaster struck. His beloved wife, Maria, fell gravely ill.
She probably had tuberculosis and had always been delicate, but also her fate, as was the fate of an awful lot of middle-class Regency wives, was almost incessant pregnancy. She had 7 children and 2 miscarriages in about a decade, and that obviously had a seriously bad effect on her health.
Maria died shortly after the birth of her 7th child, and Constable was totally devastated. The face of the world had changed for him, he wrote in a letter to his brother. He wore mourning for the rest of his life, and he never really got over her demise.
Constable was overwhelmed by melancholy. His first major and much dreamed of triumph as an artist was now overshadowed by domestic disaster. How would he possibly survive these blows? John Constable had struggled to follow his dream of becoming an artist, and then finally with the Hay Wain, his fortunes seemed to have changed. After more than 2 decades of finding his art almost entirely unappreciated or rejected, by the 1820s, John Constable was enjoying a period of unanticipated artistic success. But this success didn't translate into hard cash, and it was followed by tragedy. The death of his much-loved wife, Maria, had left him a single father with 7 children dependent on him.
One of the unusual things about Constable, he's one of the very few major artists who was a decent human being. He really was a good, affectionate, faithful husband and a very good and loving and dutiful father who did his best to bring up a large family of young children after Maria died on his own for the next decade.
He may never have had the huge financial success in England he deserved, but he did finally receive the recognition he'd so craved from the Royal Academy.
Constable is finally made a Royal Academician in 1829, over a quarter of a century after his rival Turner, for example. It's a very bittersweet occasion for him. Finally, he's got this professional endorsement he's worked so hard all his life to achieve, but it comes too late in order to be able to share it with his love.
And another, I think, greater accolade was to follow. When he was 56, the widowed Constable was on board a horse and carriage heading back to London from Suffolk.
He saw the countryside that he loved, and he just mentioned to his fellow passengers, "Oh, isn't it beautiful?" And a gentleman sitting near him on the carriage said, "But of course, it's Constable country." And you just have to imagine the poor man had been so melancholy, so depressed. It must have given him such a boost. He was delighted to know that he'd actually made a mark on people's psyches and people's attitudes towards what he loved as well.
John Constable died in 1837, and for such a devoted family man, it's fitting that he left most of his work to his daughter. She, in turn, bequeathed the paintings and sketches to the nation. They went on display in 1888 at the National Gallery, and that is when something quite extraordinary happened.
For the first time, people see his en plein air sketches. These very fresh, simple, beautiful studies made out of doors. And because of later movements like Impressionism, they now can judge these things and realise the value and the originality and innovations that Constable had brought to them. And Constable, in some ways, gets reinvented with definitely a sense of patriotic pride that actually here was Constable, the British artist, doing it a good 50 years before the French.
People flocked to see them because it was a sense of nostalgia. And also it was a bit of peace from the noise and the hubbub of city life. You know, they could lose themselves in the landscape, in nature.
And the biggest draw, obviously, was the Hay Wain.
It became instantly popular. It suddenly seemed to be a symbol of Britain in the British countryside. And in fact, it was so popular that by the 1890s, Thomas Cook had started to organise tourist visits to Constable country so that people could see where the Hay Wain was set.
You've got to remember that sort of in the 19th century, there were new trains taking people on trips around England. People wanted to go to Constable country.
It's still called Constable country today. And what's quite fascinating is that Constable really created a world that tourism then kept pristine.
The National Trust's Simon Peachy works as part of the team maintaining and preserving this iconic scene.
So if you walk this way, this is the Hay Wain view. Standing here, it's like stepping inside Constable's painting. So on the left-hand side, you've got Willie Lott's house, and you can see if the building is pretty similar today to how it was in Constable's time. You've got the mill pond right in front of you. And again, in Constable's painting, you've got the hay cart sitting in the middle of the mill pond. You've even got some oak trees. They're probably not the same oak trees that were there in Constable's time. But if you look through to the distance, that mass of trees, that's in exactly the same place as it was in Constable's time. So literally, standing here, you're stepping into his painting. You're almost walking in his footsteps.
Every year, 250,000 people come to admire the prospect that inspired Constable's Hay Wain all those years ago.
We like to say to visitors that we've got the original of the Hay Wain, and the National Gallery has got the copy that was done by John Constable.
The landscape Constable painted is now an important part of the history of British art. But it's more than that. It's ingrained in our lives. It's so very familiar, an image found on countless calendars, biscuit tins, cushions and jigsaws in households all around the country. John Constable has taken a sentimental rural vision and raised it to an ecstatic level. Yes, this bears no relationship to what was actually happening in Suffolk at the time. And yes, the more you think about it, it is an almost ridiculously banal image. It is the 1820s equivalent of a battered white van leaving a Tesco forecourt on its way to make a food delivery. This is John Constable gives you logistics solutions. And yet, when you look at it, it is impossible not to feel humbled and proud and very moved indeed. It is a golden age painting, full of the enjoyment of nature, fresh, delicious. You want to be there. You want to stand in that field and smell the wildflowers and feel the wind in your face as the clouds scud over your head. It is a deeply, deeply nostalgic painting, and nostalgia is a very powerful emotion. John Constable took the ordinary, the English ordinary, and he made it epic. He made it majestic. And by doing that, he touched the soul of the English forever. And that is why this is one of the world's great paintings. Next time, an image that stirred passion and anger for nearly 400 years. When it was made, this kind of image was outlawed, forbidden, and certainly never to be seen in public. A groundbreaking work of rare beauty.
He's really fascinated by the whiteness or the paleness of her flesh. So it's quite a sexy picture.
That defied the Spanish Inquisition and roused the suffragettes into violent action.
What she had concealed about her person was some form of meat cleaver.
The remarkable story of the Rokeby Venus.